The move that ends this particular story is not a confrontation. It is a single document, filed quietly on a Tuesday afternoon, that reclassifies a family trust in a way Dana Webb never anticipated. That one filing made every subsequent argument she planned to have completely irrelevant. You're watching His Eternal Diary. The smell of jet fuel and fine sand had lived inside Marcus Webb's sinuses for 14 months. It had settled into the creases of his neck, into the fabric of his uniform, into the small scar below his left ear, where a piece of IED shrapnel had kissed him in Kandahar province and decided, apparently, to leave him alive. That smell was the first thing he noticed, stepping off the transport at Fort Campbell. That it was gone. Clean Tennessee air hit him like a small grief. His lungs didn't know what to do with the absence of it. He stood on the tarmac for exactly 4 seconds, with his kit bag over one shoulder and his ruck at his feet, and he breathed. Just breathed. The September sky above Kentucky was the kind of pale blue that has no business existing anywhere near a combat theater. And for those 4 seconds, Marcus allowed himself to simply exist inside it. Then he checked his phone. 41 unread messages. Most of them from his mother. 3 from his unit's family liaison. 2 from his bank. Notifications he didn't remember setting up, but had, apparently, in a moment of administrative foresight, before his last rotation. And nothing from Dana. He read the bank notifications first, standing there on the tarmac, while soldiers moved around him like water around a stone. The first notification, a wire transfer of $11,000 from their joint savings account, dated 6 weeks ago. The second, a balance alert, triggered when the same account dropped below the threshold he'd set at $3,000. The account currently held $2,142. 3 days ago, Marcus put the phone in his cargo pocket. He picked up his ruck. He walked to the processing building with the same measured stride he used when he was moving through unknown territory. Weight distributed, breathing even, eyes reading everything. He had learned, in 14 months in places where the cost of emotional reaction was often measured in blood, how to separate the animal part of his brain, the part that wanted to feel, from the operational part, the part that assessed and calculated and decided. He had not always been able to do that. Before his first deployment at 24, he had been a man who led with his chest, who let rage translate directly into action, who had once, at 22, broken 3 knuckles punching a wall because a girlfriend had lied to him about something minor. That man was a liability, or that man was dead. The man who walked off the tarmac at Fort Campbell had been forged into something different by heat and time, and the particular discipline of having to think clearly while the world was detonating around him. He was 31 years old. He had a master's degree in business administration he'd completed online during deployments. He had, in the last 14 months, spent 260 hours studying financial forensics and estate law under the informal tutelage of Captain Elaine Doss, JAG Corps, and a civilian contractor named Raymond Park, who had been hired to trace the financial networks of 3 separate insurgent organizations and had, in the course of doing so, become Marcus's closest friend. Was Raymond had a saying. The most dangerous man in any room is the one who already knows what happened before he walked in. Marcus had not known what happened before he walked in, but he was beginning to understand the shape of it. He did not go home that night. This was unusual. Most soldiers on returning from extended deployments went home within hours of processing, pulled by the gravitational force of domestic life, the particular hunger for a bed that didn't move, for a meal that didn't come in a pouch, for the sound of something familiar. Marcus had felt that pull on his first 2 deployments. He had driven home both times with his heart doing something embarrassing in his chest. This time he checked into a Marriott off the interstate, paid cash for 3 nights, and sat on the edge of the bed with his laptop open and his bank's customer service number already dialed. The woman who answered was polite and efficient. Marcus explained that he was a returning service member reviewing his accounts. He asked for a detailed transaction history for both the joint checking and joint savings accounts for the past 14 months. She offered to email it. He said he'd prefer to stay on the line while she walked him through the highlights. There was a slight hesitation. Then she began. The joint checking, where his military pay was deposited and from which Dana handled household expenses, showed a pattern Marcus had anticipated. Monthly mortgage payment on the house in Clarksville, utilities, groceries, the normal topography of a maintained household. But there was additional texture. Restaurant charges, and consistently 3 to 4 times per week, at establishments Marcus didn't recognize. A gym membership that wasn't the one Dana had held before his deployment. Recurring charges to a streaming service he'd never subscribed to on an account he didn't own. Clothing purchases at stores he couldn't place. None of this was, individually, alarming. People's lives changed. 14 months was a long time. But the joint savings account was a different geography entirely. $11,000 wired 6 weeks ago. The recipient account, a business entity called Hargrove Consolidated LLC, registered in the state of Tennessee. Before that, a transfer of $4,000, dated 5 months prior. Same recipient. Before that, a transfer of $3,000, dated 9 months prior. Same recipient, $18,000 total. Just from an account that had held, before his deployment, $44,000 in combined savings. Marcus thanked the customer service representative, ended the call, and opened a new browser tab. Hargrove Consolidated LLC, Tennessee Secretary of State Business Registry. The registration was 11 months old. Principal Officer, Theodore Allen Hargrove. Business address, 14 Meridian Court, Clarksville, Tennessee. Marcus sat with that for a moment. 14 Meridian Court was his address. He had purchased that house 4 years ago, before he and Dana had married, using a combination of a VA loan and a disbursement from the Webb Family Trust, a trust established by his father, a retired Army colonel who had died 3 years prior and left Marcus the sole beneficiary. The trust documents, drafted by a Nashville estate attorney named Gerald Cho, contained specific language that Marcus had not paid close attention to at the time of signing, but which Raymond Park had, during one of their late-night sessions in a dusty FOB in Helmand Province, explained to him with the particular enthusiasm of a man who found legal architecture genuinely beautiful. The language read, in essence, all real property purchased with trust disbursements, or held in the name of the trust, retains its character as separate property regardless of any subsequent marital or cohabitation arrangements. The house at 14 Meridian Court had been purchased in the name of the Webb Family Trust. It was not marital property. It had never been marital property. Dana did not know this. He slept 4 hours, which was more than he usually managed in the field. He woke at 4:30 out of habit, showered in water that was hotter than anything he'd felt in over a year, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long moment. He looked the same. That was always strange to him, the disconnect between interior transformation and exterior continuity. He was still 6'2", still lean in the way of men who never stop moving, still dark-complexioned with the kind of face his mother called serious, and his father had called watchful. The scar under his ear had faded to a thin silver line. His eyes were the same dark brown they had always been. He looked like Marcus Webb, He did not feel like Marcus Webb. He felt like something that had been Marcus Webb and had been reprocessed into a cleaner, colder version of the same raw material. And he made coffee from the room's drip machine. It tasted like the memory of coffee. And he called Raymond Park. Raymond answered on the second ring, which meant he was either awake or had never gone to sleep. With Raymond, both were equally likely. Webb. Raymond's voice was the same as always, flat, coastal, like someone who had grown up in Los Angeles and then spent 20 years learning to excise all evidence of emotion from his vocal delivery. You're stateside. Since yesterday. You sound like you already found something. $18,000 out of joint savings. The recipient is an LLC registered to a man named Theodore Hargrove. Business address is my home address. A pause. Not a long one. Raymond's pauses were always calibrated. Oh, does your wife have signature authority on the joint savings? She does. So the transfers are legal. Technically. But you're thinking about whether there are other angles. I'm thinking about several things, Marcus said. Okay. Raymond's keyboard began clicking in the background. Give me the LLC registration details. Marcus read them out. Raymond typed. Marcus drank his terrible coffee and looked out the hotel window at the parking lot, which was lit orange by sodium vapor lamps, and contained, at this hour, mostly truckers and a single minivan with a sleeping family visible through the fogged glass. Hargrove Consolidated LLC, Raymond said. 11 months old. Filed as a general contractor business. No employees listed. No active contracts in the state business database. No website. Revenue, $0. As according to the last annual filing. Another pause. The address for the registered agent is a law office in Nashville. That's standard for shell operations. Doesn't mean anything yet. But combined with 0 revenue and a 14-month lifespan, you're looking at something that exists on paper without existing in practice. A money hole. A money hole, Raymond confirmed. Your wife has been funding a failing, possibly fictitious, business operated by a man who is apparently living in your house. Marcus said nothing. How do you want to play this? Raymond asked. Slowly, Marcus said, and correctly. Raymond made a sound that in another man might have been a laugh. I'll start pulling the public financial records. You should talk to Gerald Cho. I already have an appointment, Marcus said. 9 o'clock. Another pause, slightly longer. You made an appointment with your estate attorney before you went home. Yes. Webb. Raymond's voice contained something that might, in lesser circumstances, have been called admiration. You are a genuinely unsettling human being. Marcus drained the last of the coffee. I'll be in touch. Gerald Cho's office was on the 6th floor of a building in downtown Nashville that smelled of recycled air and carpet cleaning solution. The waiting room had framed landscape prints and a receptionist who offered Marcus water in a glass, not a bottle, which he took as a sign that Cho had done well for himself in the years since drafting the Webb Trust documents. Cho came out to meet him personally. He was 62, compact, was with close-cropped silver hair and the careful handshake of a man who had spent decades understanding that physical contact was a form of information exchange. He looked at Marcus the way people sometimes looked at returning soldiers, a flicker of something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite relief. And then he led him back to a corner office with a view of the Cumberland River. I assumed when you called that this was a routine review, Cho said, settling behind his desk with a yellow legal pad already positioned in front of him. But you said urgent. It's urgent, Marcus said. He laid out what he knew. Not all of it, not the hotel, not the 4 a.m. call to Raymond, not the full texture of what he'd been feeling since standing on that tarmac. Just the facts, the transfers, The LLC, the address, the cohabitation. He spoke without inflection, as though he were delivering a tactical briefing, and Cho listened in the same spirit, writing in a tight, shorthand script that Marcus couldn't read. When Marcus finished, Cho put his pen down. "The house," he said. "Walk me through it." Cho folded his hands. The property at 14 Meridian Court was purchased with a disbursement from the Webb Family Trust and titled in the trust's name at closing. At the time of your marriage to Dana Reyes, I advised you, and you signed an acknowledgement, that because the property predated the marriage and was held in trust, it retained its character as separate property under Tennessee law. She would have no claim to it in a divorce. Correct. Nor could she encumber it without your consent. Cho paused. She has not attempted to do so. And I assume. Not that I've found. Good, because Tennessee Code Annotated, Section 36-4-121, is very clear on separate property characterization. Even if marital funds were used to pay the mortgage during the marriage, those contributions can be argued as occupancy costs rather than improvements, particularly if there's no documentation of intent to commingle the asset. He picked up his pen again. The more immediate concern is the savings account. I know. The transfers were made by an authorized signatory. Legally, she had the right to make them. But, Marcus said. Cho looked at him over the rim of his reading glasses. But if those funds were transferred in anticipation of a divorce, if it can be shown that she was deliberately depleting marital assets knowing the marriage was effectively over, that constitutes dissipation under Tennessee law. It's a factor courts consider in equitable distribution. I need documentation of the nature of her relationship with Hargrove and the timeline of when it began. That would be helpful, yes. And I need to understand what happens to the LLC. Cho was quiet for a moment. What do you mean? If marital funds were used to capitalize a business entity, that business entity may constitute a marital asset, regardless of whose name it's in. Cho looked at him steadily for a moment. You've been doing some reading. I've had time. You're right, Cho said. If Hargrove Consolidated LLC was funded primarily with marital funds, which it appears it was, and if the operating agreement or any documentation names your wife as a beneficial party, she may have inadvertently created a marital asset that is subject to equitable distribution. He uncapped his pen. Which means that in a divorce proceeding, you could potentially claim a portion of that LLC's value. Or its debts, Cho paused. Or its debts, he agreed. If the LLC has outstanding liabilities, they could be argued as marital liabilities depending on the circumstances. Marcus thought about that. $18,000 into a shell company with zero revenue and no active contracts. He thought about what Raymond would find when he pulled the deeper financial records. He thought about Theodore Hargrove living in his house, sleeping in. He stopped that thought and filed it away. Later. Not now. I want to know my position before I walk through that door, Marcus said. That's wise. I'm not going to walk in angry. I'm going to walk in already done. Cho studied him for a moment with the particular attention of a man who had spent 40 years watching people in the worst circumstances of their lives and had learned to read the difference between grief and strategy. What he saw in Marcus Webb's face appeared to resolve something for him. I'll have a comprehensive memo on the trust documents and the property characterization to you by end of day, he said. I'll also begin research on the dissipation argument. You'll want to retain a financial forensics specialist. I have one. Cho nodded and wrote something on his pad. One more thing, he said. The military allotment. Marcus went still. Your military pay allotment, the portion deposited to the joint account monthly. That's been ongoing throughout the deployment? Yes. If you can document that the allotment payments continued without interruption while marital assets were being depleted through transfers to a third party's business venture, that strengthens the dissipation argument considerably. He paused. It also raises questions about whether she misrepresented the marital situation to the Military Benefits Administration, a separate matter, but one worth noting. Marcus thought about Dana at some point in the past 11 months, filling out or not filling out some form, saying or not saying something to some official. He would need to pull the allotment records. He already knew that he would. Yet he drove to Clarksville with the windows down. The Tennessee landscape in September had a specific quality he had carried in his memory through 14 months of dust and rock. The way the hills go slightly golden at the edges before the real color change begins. The way the light at 2 in the afternoon has a warmth that isn't quite summer and isn't yet fall. He had thought about this drive many times in the field. He had imagined it differently. He had imagined Dana on the phone as he turned off the interstate. He had imagined walking through the door to something that smelled like her cooking and felt like a world that still held his shape. He turned his phone over on the passenger seat. Dana had still not called or texted. 41 hours since he'd processed back to stateside. Was if she had received any notification through the family liaison, which she should have, as his designated emergency contact, she knew he was home. He pulled into the driveway at 14 Meridian Court at 2:47 in the afternoon. The house looked the same from the outside. Red brick, black shutters, the oak tree in the front yard that had been 12 feet tall when he bought the place and was now significantly more ambitious. The lawn had been mowed recently. There was a truck in the driveway, a black F250 newish, with a contractor's logo on the door panel that read Hargrove Consolidated in a clean sans serif font. Marcus parked behind it and sat for a moment. He looked at the truck. He looked at the house. He felt, in the dead center of his chest, a sensation that he had no accurate name for. It was not anger. Anger was a hot thing, was an expansive thing, and this was neither. It was more like the feeling of standing at the edge of something that had already happened. A completed fact that his nervous system was only now being asked to process. He had crossed a threshold sometime in the past 41 hours in the Marriott room with his terrible coffee. And what existed on the other side of that threshold was a cold and operational clarity that made anger seem like a child's response. He got out of the truck. He used his key. The door opened onto the foyer, and the first thing he noticed was the smell. The house smelled different. Not bad, just different. There was a cologne in the air that wasn't his, a synthetic, woody citrus note that had settled into the walls and the fabric of the space like an occupancy marker. There was also the smell of food, something with garlic coming from the kitchen. The second thing he noticed was the jacket on the coat rack by the door. Not Dana's. A man's jacket, brown leather, large. Too large to be Marcus's. He stood in his own foyer with his kit bag over one shoulder, and he looked at that jacket for exactly 3 seconds. Then he walked toward the kitchen. Dana was at the stove. She was wearing jeans and a soft blue top he didn't recognize, and her hair was down, which she usually didn't do at home, and she was stirring something in a pot with the comfortable ease of a person in a space that feels entirely theirs. She had her phone propped against the backsplash, and she was watching something on it, and she did not hear him until he was nearly in the kitchen doorway. When she turned, whilst the color that left her face was so immediate and total that for a moment she looked like a photographic negative of herself. "Marcus." She said it in a voice that had no preparation in it at all. Just the raw fact of his name, ejected by surprise. "Dana," he said. He looked at her the way he had trained himself to look at everything in the field, with complete perceptual attention and no narrative attached. He was reading her, not responding to her. The micro-expressions, the way her hand tightened on the spoon, the way her eyes moved just fractionally toward the hallway that led to the living room, in the involuntary gesture of someone checking to see if a third party is within earshot. "You're home," she said. "Apparently." She set the spoon down. She turned fully toward him, and he watched her assemble herself. Yet watched the surprise get packed down and replaced with something more managed. She had always been good at that, at presenting a composed surface. It was one of the things he had initially admired about her. The irony of that was not lost on him. "I didn't know the exact date," she said. "They said, the liaison said there was a window, they weren't sure." 3 weeks, Marcus said. "They gave you a 3-week window, centered on September 14th. Today is the 16th. She didn't respond to that. "Whose truck is in the driveway?" he asked. The question was unhurried. He asked it the way he might ask about the weather, as a request for information, nothing more. He watched her face calibrate. "A friend," she said. "He's been helping with some things around the house." "What kind of things? Maintenance? Just things that needed doing while you were gone." 14 months of things. She met his eyes then, and he saw in her gaze the calculation happening in real time. How much does he know? How much has he guessed? What is the optimal shape for this conversation to take? He gave her nothing to work with. He just watched. "He's in the living room," she said, finally. "I know," Marcus said. Because the jacket was the right size, and the truck was outside, and someone had been cooking in this kitchen, and Dana had never made anything with garlic in the 4 years he had known her, because she said the smell lingered too long. He walked past her into the living room. Theodore Hargrove was 34 years old, approximately 6 feet tall, and had the particular build of a man who worked out enough to feel confident in fitted shirts, but not enough to have ever faced a physical situation he couldn't talk his way out of. He was sitting on Marcus's couch, the leather sectional Marcus had bought at a moving sale before his second deployment, that still had the slight scuff on the left corner from the time he and his buddy Keene had tried to carry it up the stairs alone and failed. He was sitting on that couch with his phone in his hand and his socked feet on the coffee table. And when Marcus walked in, he had the delayed and unconvincing reflexes of a man who had, on some level, expected this moment and had still not adequately prepared for it. He stood up. He was almost Marcus's height, maybe an inch shorter, and he had the kind of lean handsomeness that required maintenance and read in person as slightly effortful. He had brown eyes and stubble that was calibrated to look accidental, and wasn't. He opened his mouth. Marcus looked at him for 4 seconds without speaking. Then he said very quietly, "I need you to take your jacket and your truck and leave my property." He did not raise his voice. He did not take a step toward Hargrove. He did not change his expression. He simply stated a fact that was also a direction in the tone he used in the field when he needed compliance without escalation. Hargrove looked past him toward Dana, who had followed and was standing in the doorway. "Marcus," Dana said. "I'm not speaking to you right now," Marcus said, still looking at Hargrove. "I'm giving your friend a direction. I'm going to wait in the kitchen. He has 3 minutes." He turned and walked back to the kitchen. He stood at the kitchen counter, looking out the window at the backyard. The backyard was the same. The gas grill he'd bought on sale, the garden beds Dana had started the spring before his last deployment, and never quite finished. There was a new set of outdoor furniture on the patio that he didn't recognize. It was nice furniture. Teak, with cushions in a deep navy. He thought about who had paid for it. He heard movement in the living room. Low voices. then the sound of the front door. The truck in the driveway started and pulled out. He heard the engine fade. Then Dana's footsteps in the kitchen. He didn't turn around. "I know this looks," she began. "Don't," he said. He heard her stop. "How long?" he asked. He asked it at the window, as at his own yard, at the teak furniture he had not purchased. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he turned to look at her. She looked the way people looked after they'd been caught. Not the immediate shock of discovery, but the particular deflation that followed, when the energy spent on the maintenance of a lie was suddenly no longer required. She looked tired. She looked younger than he remembered, and older at the same time. 7 months, she said. He nodded. He turned back to the window. "Marcus, I don't need an explanation," he said. "I need to understand some things about the money." A different kind of silence, then. "What money?" she said. "The joint savings account. The transfers to Hargrove Consolidated LLC. He heard the quality of the silence change. He needed help getting the business started, and he was going to pay it back. He registered the LLC at this address, Marcus said. This address, my address. His registered agent is a Nashville law firm. He has no revenue, no active contracts, and no evident means to repay $18,000. Silence. "I didn't know he was going to register it here. That was just a stop." The word came out the same way all the words were coming out. Quiet, precise, without heat. "I'm not interested in the justifications. I'm interested in the facts." He turned to face her. "You transferred $18,000 of our joint savings to a man's business without my knowledge or consent, while I was deployed in a combat theater. You allowed that man to move into this house. You made this house his business address without my consent." She looked at the floor. "I need you to understand something," Marcus said. "I'm not going to have a scene. I'm not going to raise my voice. I'm going to tell you one thing, and then I'm going to go." She looked up. "This house is held in the Webb Family Trust. It is not marital property. It was not marital property the day we married. It is not marital property today. Whatever you understood about our situation, that fact has not changed, and nothing you've done in the past 14 months changes it." He held her gaze. "I'll be staying elsewhere tonight. I'll be in touch through counsel." He picked up his kit bag from the hallway where he'd set it down, and he walked out of his own house. He drove back to the Marriott and sat in the parking lot for a while. He was not feeling nothing. He wanted to be clear about that. And even in the privacy of his own interior landscape, there was a sensation. Deep in the center of his chest, beneath the operational calm, behind the coldness he had learned to cultivate, that was the wreckage of something that had been real once. He had loved Donna Reyes. He had loved her with the particular intensity of a man who did not love easily or often, who had carried her face through 2 prior deployments like a talisman, who had built a specific imaginary future in his mind that included her in every room. That future was gone now. He understood that with the same clinical clarity with which he would understand a structural failure, not lamenting the collapse, simply updating the map. But the man who had loved her was still in there somewhere, behind the glass, watching. He made a note to check on that later, when there was time. He called Raymond. "What did you find?" Raymond's keyboard had been going the whole time. "Hargrove Consolidated LLC is officially a residential construction and renovation company, but the business bank account, which I found through the Tennessee Business Filings registered agent records, shows no income. The account had a beginning balance of $4,000 at founding, which matches the first transfer from your joint savings, a subsequent deposit of $3,000, which matches the second transfer, A deposit of $11,000, which matches the third. A pause. The account has current holdings of approximately $600. The rest is gone. Disbursements characterized as operating expenses, most of them in amounts below $5,000, which is a structuring pattern worth noting. He's been paying himself, Marcus said. Looks like small amounts, consistent intervals, structured to avoid the $10,000 reporting threshold. It's not sophisticated, but it's deliberate. Somebody, maybe a low-rent financial advisor, maybe someone who watched a YouTube video about asset structuring, told him to keep the withdrawals under 5 figures. What about documentation naming Dana as a beneficial party? Nothing in the public filings. But if there's a private operating agreement, which all LLCs should have but not all file publicly, and if it names her in any capacity, that changes things significantly. A click of the keyboard. I'd want to subpoena the LLC's bank records in any proceeding. The disbursement pattern would be useful. What about the money itself? Oh, is there any argument for recovery? Depends on how you approach it. If you pursue the dissipation argument, she depleted marital assets in anticipation of divorce, the court can account for the $18,000 in the equitable distribution calculation. Basically, she'd be treated as having already received $18,000 of the marital estate. If there are other assets to divide, you'd get a larger share to offset it. A pause. The other angle is whether the LLC itself constitutes a marital asset. If it was funded primarily with marital money, which it was, then you have an argument that some portion of whatever the LLC is worth, or whatever it owes, is subject to distribution. Raymond paused. Webb, I want to be straight with you. Even with all of this, those divorce proceedings in Tennessee are equitable distribution, not punitive. The goal is a fair outcome, not a crushing one. What you can realistically expect is to come out of this with the house, which was never at risk, and with an equitable adjustment for the marital funds that were dissipated. That's enough, Marcus said. Raymond was quiet for a moment. You're sure? Marcus looked at the orange-lit parking lot. I didn't come back here to hurt anyone, Ray. I came back here to make sure that whatever happened next, I had already thought of it first. He paused. I came back here to be done. A pause from Raymond's end. I'll have a full financial summary to you by morning. Send it to Cho? Yes. And Webb? Raymond stopped, started again. For what it's worth. Don't, Marcus said. Right. The keyboard clicked once more. I'll be in touch. He stayed at the Marriott for 4 more days. During those 4 days, he conducted his affairs with the systematic precision of a man deconstructing a complex structure that must be brought down in a controlled manner. No sudden collapses, no cascading failures, no civilian casualties. He did not approach any of it with hate. Hate was a fuel that burned fast and dirty and left residue. He approached it the way he approached the breach of a fortified position, with sufficient preparation, correct sequencing, and the understanding that the first move was rarely the decisive one. On the first day, he visited the Joint Legal Assistance Office at Fort Campbell and spoke with a JAG officer about his rights as a service member with respect to the Service Members Civil Relief Act. The SCRA provided certain protections regarding financial obligations, lease agreements, and legal proceedings, none of which directly applied to his situation, since he was now stateside. But the conversation provided useful context about how military financial records were maintained and how they could be subpoenaed in civil proceedings. He also pulled his complete allotment records for the past 14 months and had them certified. On the second day, Gerald Cho sent him a 23-page memo covering the trust property characterization, the dissipation argument, and a detailed analysis of the Hargrove LLC's status as a potential marital asset. The memo's conclusion was measured and careful, as all good legal memos are, but its underlying message was clear. Marcus Webb's position was strong. His wife had, as in the process of pursuing her own interests, inadvertently strengthened his. On the third day, Raymond Park sent him the financial summary. It contained a full transaction-level analysis of both the joint checking and savings accounts, a breakdown of the LLC's bank activity drawn from public filings and registered agent records, and a 3-page section that Raymond titled, without any visible irony, Timeline of Cohabitation. This section cross-referenced the account activity with a review of Dana's public social media, which Marcus had not looked at during his deployment, a discipline he had exercised deliberately, and established a reasonably precise timeline of when Theodore Hargrove had become a fixture in Dana's life, and then in Marcus's house. The timeline began 9 months ago, 2 months after Marcus's deployment began, or 1 month after the first transfer to Hargrove Consolidated LLC. Marcus read it once, filed it, and did not read it again. On the 4th day, he filed for divorce. He filed on grounds of adultery, which in Tennessee remains a relevant factor in equitable distribution proceedings. Gerald Cho had counseled him that this approach, combined with the dissipation argument and the trust property documentation, created the clearest possible statement of his legal position. The adultery ground was not about moral weight. It was documentation. It was the factual record entered into the court system of what had happened. Nothing more and nothing less. Dana was served at 14 Meridian Court at approximately 2 in the afternoon by a process server Marcus had retained through Cho's office. Cho sent him a text when the service was confirmed. Done. Shut. Marcus was sitting in a coffee shop near the courthouse when the text came through. He was drinking a black coffee, real coffee this time, not the hotel machine variety, and reading a report on Tennessee real estate market conditions that had no direct relevance to his situation, but which he found calming, in the way that reading structured information had always calmed him. The data was orderly. The data had no complicated feelings about what had happened. He read the text. He put the phone face down. He drank his coffee. Dana called him 4 times in the first 24 hours after service. He did not answer. On the 5th call, he let it go to voicemail and listened to the message. She was crying. She said she needed to talk to him. She said this didn't have to happen this way. She said she was sorry. And he noted the content of the message, deleted it, and forwarded a memo to Cho noting that direct contact had been attempted. Theodore Hargrove called once, from a number Marcus didn't recognize, the evening of the 5th day. Marcus answered because he didn't know the number. "This is Theo," the voice said. It was a voice that had confidence in it, or the residue of confidence, the performed version of it. "I think we should talk." Marcus said nothing. "Man to man," Hargrove said. Marcus thought about that phrase. Man to man. He thought about what it meant to the man saying it, the implication of equivalence, of a level field, of a negotiation between parties with comparable leverage. "There's nothing to talk about," Marcus said. "A process has begun. It will follow its course, and you don't have a role in it." "The house is not marital property," Marcus said. "It was never marital property. I don't need your cooperation, your understanding, or your presence in this conversation. If you have remaining possessions at that address, I'm prepared to allow you until the end of the week to retrieve them, after which they will be treated as abandoned property under Tennessee law." A pause. "That's the entirety of what I have to say to you." He ended the call. Dana retained a divorce attorney named Preston Calloway, who had a reputation in Tennessee matrimonial law circles as an aggressive litigator. Calloway filed a response to the divorce petition that contested the adultery grounds, characterized the asset transfers as reasonable household expense management made by a spouse with full legal authority, and here was where Marcus leaned forward in Cho's office, reading the response, argued that the property at 14 Meridian Court had effectively become a marital asset through Dana's contributions to its maintenance and improvement during the marriage. Marcus set the document down on Cho's conference table. "The improvement argument," he said. Cho folded his hands. "It's a Herculean argument. She would need to demonstrate that marital funds made substantial and documented improvements to the property, improvements that increased its value, and that these improvements were made with the intent to invest in the marital estate." He paused. "The trust documents are explicit, and the language I used when we drafted them was specifically designed to preempt this kind of claim." "Then why file it?" "Because Preston Calloway is not filing it because he thinks it will win. He's filing it because it complicates the proceedings, and complicated proceedings are expensive, and expensive proceedings create pressure to settle." Cho looked at him steadily. "It's a negotiating tactic, not a legal argument." Marcus thought about this. "What does he think I'll settle for?" "He doesn't know yet what you have. He's operating on the assumption that this is a standard military divorce case. Combat deployed husband, unhappy wife, some marital assets to divide, some emotional leverage. He doesn't yet know about the financial forensics report. He doesn't yet know about the dissipation argument documentation." Cho paused. He doesn't yet know that you filed on adultery grounds with a complete evidentiary package." Marcus looked out the window at the river. "When does he find out?" "Discovery," Cho said. "When we disclose the forensics report, the transaction history, and the LLC documentation." He paused. "I can tell you exactly what will happen in that meeting." "Tell me." "Calloway will call me within 48 hours of receiving discovery. He will suggest we discuss a negotiated settlement. He will frame it as being in his client's best interest, but what he will mean is that the adultery filing combined with the documented dissipation creates a risk profile for his client that makes litigation inadvisable." Cho allowed himself the smallest possible smile. "At that point, the conversation becomes about what you want." "I want the house." "You already have the house." "I want the trust property characterization confirmed by court order, not just by document. I want it on record." Cho nodded, writing. "I want the $18,000 reflected in the equitable distribution. We'll argue for offset. I want clear financial separation. Her name off every joint account. Her name off every financial instrument that touches anything connected to the trust." Marcus paused. "And I want the LLC." Cho stopped writing. "Explain." "Hargrove Consolidated LLC was funded almost entirely with marital funds. It's effectively a marital asset. I want it included in the distribution." A pause. "Not because it has value. It doesn't have value. And I want it included because including it assigns its liabilities to the equitable distribution calculation. If the LLC has any outstanding debts or obligations, which I suspect it does, given the spending pattern Raymond documented, those become part of the marital estate." Cho studied him for a long moment. "If she receives the LLC in distribution," Marcus said, "she receives both its non-existent value and whatever it owes. If she doesn't, she walks away from something that was funded with my money and that she created as a vehicle for her boyfriend's livelihood." He paused. "Either way, I want it on the record." Cho put the pen down. "You've thought about this carefully." "I've had time," Marcus said. It was the same thing he'd said before, and Cho received it the same way. with the careful attention of a man who understood that this particular client was not speaking hyperbolically when he said he had been preparing. Discovery dropped on a Tuesday. It was a dense package. Cho's office had prepared it meticulously, the kind of documentation that communicated, through its very organization and completeness, that the party filing it had done something other than react. The centerpiece was Raymond Park's financial forensics report, which ran to 61 pages and which traced, with the thoroughness of someone who had spent 2 decades following money through obscure networks in hostile countries, every dollar that had moved through the joint accounts during the marriage. The report identified the $18,000 in transfers. It identified an additional $7,000 in joint account expenditures on items that could be attributed to a second household occupant. The gym membership, the streaming service, the restaurant charges in patterns consistent with 2 people dining, the home furnishings Marcus hadn't recognized. Combined, the total of expenditures attributable to Hargrove's de facto cohabitation came to $25,000. The report also contained a section that Raymond had titled Potential USFSPA Considerations, a reference to the Uniformed Services Former Spouses Protection Act, which governed the division of military retirement benefits in divorce proceedings. This section was, in its way, the quietest and most powerful element of the document. It noted, with clinical precision, how that the length of the marriage against Marcus's years of military service created the possibility that Dana could file for a portion of his retirement benefits under the Act, and that the strength of the adultery and dissipation claims created significant countervailing considerations that any court would have to weigh in Marcus's favor. It was a warning, dressed as a note. Calloway called Cho on Thursday. 2 days after discovery, exactly as Cho had predicted. Marcus was not in the room for that call, but Cho briefed him at 4 o'clock that afternoon, in the same conference room, with the same view of the river. "He wants to settle," Cho said. "I know." His client's position is weaker than he understood. The adultery finding, combined with the dissipation documentation, creates substantial risk for her in any contested distribution. Cho looked at his notes. He proposed a settlement framework in which she receives a cash payment from the joint assets, waives any claim to the trust property, and releases all military benefits claims. What cash payment? He proposed $12,000, based on the remaining balance in the joint accounts. Marcus said nothing. "I told him we'd consider a counter," Cho said. "My recommendation is that you agree to waive the cash payment in exchange for a full and final resolution. She gets nothing from the trust, nothing from the military retirement, and the LLC is transferred to you." "Why would she take that?" "Because the alternative is a contested proceeding in which the adultery filing becomes public record, the financial forensics report becomes public record, and Preston Calloway spends the next 8 months billing her for a case she has a meaningful chance of losing." Cho paused. "She doesn't have the resources for a prolonged fight. I reviewed her financial disclosures. Between the depleted savings account and whatever Hargrove has cost her beyond what we've already documented, she's not in a strong position." Marcus thought about this. "What happens to the LLC after transfer?" "It becomes yours. You can dissolve it." Cho paused. "Which I would recommend. The liability exposure. How much does it owe?" Cho looked at his notes. Raymond identified 2 outstanding invoices from a building materials supplier, about $4,000 total, and a lease on a storage unit, month to month. There may be additional liabilities we haven't found, and it's a shell with a spending history and no revenue. The sensible move is to take it, document its current state, dissolve it with the liabilities on record, and let any creditors make claims against the dissolved entity. Which leaves Hargrove with nothing. Cho considered this carefully. He contributed nothing of documented value to the entity. If it's dissolved, any personal liability depends on the structure of the operating agreement and whether there's evidence of commingling, which, given that the registered address was your home, there may well be. Marcus nodded slowly. "I want one more thing in the settlement," he said. Cho waited. "A non-disparagement clause. Both directions. She doesn't talk about me. I don't talk about her. A permanent. Standard. And I want a full release of any and all claims she might bring in the future relating to the marriage, the military service, the trust property, or the LLC. Also standard." Cho paused. "Anything else?" Marcus looked at the river. It was late afternoon, and the light was doing something particular to the water, making it look less like water and more like hammered metal. He had a thought, sudden and unwanted, of the first time he'd driven Dana over the bridge into downtown Nashville, a year before they married, and how she had looked at the river from the car window with a kind of quiet delight that he had at the time taken as a sign of something. He let the thought pass. "No," he said. "That's all." The settlement was signed 22 days later. The terms, Dana Webb, née Reyes, had received $12,000, the approximate balance of the joint accounts after the disbursements to the LLC, which Cho had agreed to in the final negotiation as a gesture of good faith that also served to remove any potential future argument that the settlement had been coercive. She waived all claims to the trust property. She waived all claims to military benefits. She agreed to a full and final release. She received nothing from the LLC, which was transferred by quitclaim to Marcus as sole officer. She signed in Callaway's Nashville office on a Wednesday afternoon. Marcus was not present. He was, at that moment, sitting in Gerald Cho's office reading the transfer documents and verifying each provision against the checklist he had maintained since the night he'd sat in the Marriott with his terrible coffee and his bank notifications. Cho passed him the executed copy. Marcus read it cover to cover, as he always did. Then he signed where indicated. Cho extended his hand across the desk. Marcus shook it. "What happens now?" Cho asked. It was, Marcus understood, a professional question, the practical next steps, the filing, the court finalization. "Now I dissolve the LLC," Marcus said, "and then I find out what else needs doing." He stood. He picked up the executed settlement agreement and put it in his kit bag, the same kit bag he had carried off the transport at Fort Campbell, 17 days after returning from 14 months in Helmand Province. The bag smelled faintly of jet fuel and sand. He walked out through Cho's waiting room, past the landscape prints and the receptionist who offered water in a glass, and out into the afternoon, where the Tennessee light was doing its specific September thing, golden at the edges, neither summer nor fall, and which now, without the weight of what he had been carrying, looked different to him. Not better. Just different. He had a list in his phone. He opened it in the elevator, scrolling to the next item. The list had 17 more items on it. He found an apartment in Nashville, 3 weeks after the signing. It was on the 14th floor of a building in the Gulch neighborhood, a district that had been light industrial when Marcus was a kid, and had, in the intervening years, had been converted into the kind of mixed-use urban environment that real estate developers called vibrant, and that Marcus called, more neutrally, functional. The apartment was 2 bedrooms, one for sleeping, one for working, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked west toward the Cumberland River and, on clear evenings, toward the particular stripe of sky that preceded Tennessee sunsets. He furnished it sparsely. A bed, a desk, a reading chair, a kitchen table that seated 2, but was usually used by 1. He did not put anything on the walls for the first month. The walls were white. He found the white walls useful. They didn't require anything of him. He reported to his unit at Fort Campbell. He was not scheduled for another rotation for 8 months, which was both a relief and a minor problem. He functioned better with structure. And the structure of civilian life, even post-deployment, required construction rather than inheritance. He began filling the structure himself. He ran 6 miles in the morning, in the dark, along the river trail that ran behind the apartment complex. He started the reading he had been accumulating notes on during the deployment. Raymond had recommended a suite of texts on financial forensics and forensic accounting methodology that Marcus had been meaning to get to, and he got to them now, working through them in the evenings with the methodical attention he applied to everything. He contacted Raymond Park twice a week. Raymond was in Los Angeles now, working a contract that he described as tedious but financially coherent, which Marcus understood to mean that the money was good and the work was not dangerous. Sasvine. They talked in the evenings, long, rambling conversations that covered the books Marcus was reading and the operational mechanics of financial fraud detection, and occasionally, and by implication, the aftermath of what had happened. Raymond did not ask him how he was feeling. This was one of the things Marcus valued most about Raymond. What Raymond did ask 6 weeks after the settlement signing was, "What are you doing with the LLC?" "I filed dissolution paperwork last week," Marcus said. "Tennessee requires a 30-day notice to creditors. The building materials supplier has been notified. They'll file a claim against the dissolved entity." "Hargrove knows?" Hargrove's name was on the original filing as principal officer. He was notified of the dissolution as required. Marcus paused. "Because the dissolution removes the registered address. This address no longer exists as a business location in any state filing. It removes him from anything that was legally associated with that address." Another pause. "It removes him from anything I had to look at." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "And the house?" "Still in the trust. Rented as of 2 weeks ago. Decent tenants. A couple. Young, first rental after buying out of a lease. They asked if they could put a garden in the backyard." He paused. "I said yes." "You're not going back?" "No." "Nashville." "Nashville," Marcus confirmed. Raymond made a sound that was not quite the laugh equivalent, but was, in Raymond's emotional register, something adjacent. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he said. "What?" "That night in Helmand when you asked me to explain the trust characterization language to you. It was 2 a.m. We'd both been awake for 30 hours. There was mortar fire every 40 minutes. And you pulled out the trust documents and said—" Raymond paused. "You said, 'I want to understand exactly what this means.'" Marcus didn't say anything. "I thought it was a strange time to be interested in estate law," Raymond said. "It turned out to be the right time," Marcus said. Another pause. "You knew?" "I didn't know," Marcus said. "I felt something." He thought about how to say it accurately. "You develop a sense, after enough deployments, for when something at home is wrong. It's not specific. It's not a premonition. It's a shift in the texture of the communication. Things are slightly off, slightly too managed, slightly too cheerful or not cheerful enough. The calls getting shorter, the messages becoming more administrative." A pause. "I didn't know what it was. I just thought I should understand my position." Raymond was quiet for a long time. 260 hours, he said finally. "Approximately. Of studying financial forensics and estate law. Because you had a feeling." "Because I wanted to be ready," Marcus said, "for whatever I came home to." He received a letter from Hargrove Consolidated, LLC's building materials supplier 4 weeks after the dissolution filing. It was, as expected, a creditor's claim against the dissolved entity, $4,080, submitted in accordance with the 30-day notice requirement. As the dissolution officer of record, S. Marcus acknowledged receipt and filed the standard response. The dissolved entity had insufficient assets to satisfy the claim. The claim would be discharged in the dissolution. He did this without drama. It was paperwork. It was the administrative conclusion of something that had tried to become larger than it was. He also received, in the same week, a certified letter from Dana's attorney, not Calloway, a different one, which turned out to be entirely unrelated to the divorce. It was a notification regarding a minor tax matter from the previous year's joint return, a discrepancy that had triggered a query from the IRS. He forwarded it to Cho, who resolved it in 2 exchanges. He did not hear from Dana directly. He did not hear from Hargrove. The silence felt less like avoidance and more like the natural settling of something that had concluded. He had not wanted a scene, and he had not gotten one. He had not wanted to be dramatic, and he had not been dramatic. He had wanted to come home from a deployment to his life, and what he had found instead was the end of a version of his life, and he had handled that end with the tools available to him. And now it was over. He was not entirely sure what came next. He thought about this in the mornings, on the river trail, watching the Nashville skyline develop its early light. He was 31 years old. He had a house he was renting to other people because he could not yet determine what to do with it. He had an apartment with white walls and 2 bedrooms. He had 8 months before his next rotation. He had a list on his phone with items yet unaddressed. He thought about what he wanted. The question felt larger than it should have, and he recognized that as a function of the past months, the compression of everything into strategy and execution had temporarily evacuated the space where desire usually lived. He was operationally extremely competent. He was, at present, living with the reduced interior life of a man who had converted most of his available energy into precise action and had not yet reinvested in anything more expansive. He thought about his MBA, which he had completed but not leveraged. He thought about Raymond's world, the financial forensics, the institutional analysis, the work of following money through complex systems. He thought about the 61-page report that had, in a very real sense, changed the course of his life, and about the particular satisfaction he had felt reading it, not because of what it documented, but because of the architecture of it, the way it made visible something that had been deliberately obscured. He thought about Gerald Cho's face when he had explained the LLC strategy in the conference room, that particular stillness that said he had not expected this client to think 3 moves ahead. He opened his phone and looked at the list. Item 14. MBA to CPA Bridge Program Inquiry. Item 15. Contact Raymond to Private Sector Transition Options. Item 16. Review trust documents for rental property optimization. He pulled up the program website for Vanderbilt's Professional Accounting and Financial Forensics Certificate, which he had bookmarked 6 weeks ago. He'd been looking at it with the distanced attention of a man who is not yet ready to decide, but wants the information close. He read it again. Enrollment was open. The next cohort started in January. He filled out the inquiry form. Then he continued his run. October arrived, and with it the particular quality of Tennessee fall that is so different from summer's heat as to feel like a different country entirely. The air suddenly possessed of an edge, the leaves beginning their slow revelation of hidden color. The morning runs requiring a layer now, a thing he had missed in Hellman's perpetual variations on dry and hotter dry. He had a routine. He had not had a routine since before the deployment, since before everything, and the routine felt like water after a long thirst. Not dramatic, not a relief, just necessary and right. Morning run. Coffee at a shop on the corner of 11th and Division that did not call itself artisanal and had no exposed brick. Just 3 tables and an espresso machine and a man named Curtis who made change with the efficiency of someone who had been making change for 30 years and was comfortable with that. Reading until 9. Fort Campbell reports and administrative duties until noon. Afternoons variable. He signed up for a continuing education course in financial forensics at Belmont University on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. The instructor was a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, who had spent 12 years at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit before taking an academic position, and who had the particular pedagogical gift of making complex money movement concepts feel like architecture, clear, purposeful, elegant when understood correctly. Marcus found himself, for the first time in years, sitting in a classroom and genuinely engaged by what was being presented to him. He called Raymond after the 3rd class. "I'm taking a financial forensics course." "Of course you are." Raymond's tone suggested this was entirely expected. "How is it?" "The instructor spent 12 years in financial crimes. She traces institutional fraud patterns using transaction clustering analysis. It's similar to what you do with network analysis, but applied to corporate account structures rather than individual movement." "I know the methodology." A pause. "What's your end game here, Webb?" Marcus considered the question. "When I was reading your 61-page report," he said, "I kept thinking about all the people who don't have a Raymond Park." Silence. Was people who are being financially manipulated? In a divorce, in a business arrangement, in an employment situation, and who don't have access to someone who can make the money visible, who can show them where it went and why. He paused. "There's a service gap there." Raymond was quiet for a long time, longer than his usual pauses. "You're thinking about consulting," Raymond said. "I'm thinking about a lot of things." "In the military divorce space specifically?" "Possibly. Service members are a financially underserved population in terms of forensic services. The SCRA provides some protections, but there's no equivalent of what you did for me, no accessible forensic analysis service that helps service members understand their financial exposure when a marriage ends." Marcus paused. "There are attorneys. There are JAG resources. Genars, there's no one who sits down with a soldier and opens the accounts and says, 'Here is exactly what has been done with your money. Here is the evidence. Here is what it means.'" Raymond clicked his keyboard once. "You'd need the CPA certification for credibility in court contexts." "Working on it." "And you'd need a business structure, some kind of LLC or professional corporation." "I have some experience with LLCs," Marcus said dryly. Raymond made the sound again, the almost laugh. Then more seriously, "Webb, this is a real idea." "I know. I mean a real, viable, substantive idea. The market gap is real, the service gap is real, the credibility you'd bring, decorated veteran, MBA, forensic certifications, that's a meaningful package." "I know," Marcus said again. "I'm not doing it yet. I have 8 months before rotation. And I'm using them correctly." He paused. "But I'm doing it eventually." "When you're ready," Raymond said. "I'll help you build it." Marcus looked out the apartment window at the Nashville skyline, the particular orange and purple of a Tennessee October sunset doing its work on the western sky. "I know," he said. "I know you will." He went back to the house in Clarksville one time, in November. Not because he needed to. The tenants were settled, the rental management company he'd engaged handled the practical matters, and there was nothing at the property that required his physical presence. He went because there was something unfinished in him about the act of leaving. The way he had walked out that September afternoon with his kit bag and his operational calm, and had driven away without looking back, which had been the correct thing to do, and which had also left something slightly unclosed. He drove on a Saturday morning, early, before the tenants would be awake. He parked on the street, not in the driveway. He looked at the house from the car. It looked the same. The oak tree was doing its fall thing now, reddish gold, extravagant, dropping leaves in the pale morning wind. The black F250 was not in the driveway. There was a small sedan there instead, and in the front garden bed a few late-season mums that the tenants had planted, orange and white against the dark mulch. He sat with the house for a while. He thought about his father, who had chosen this neighborhood, who had seen the yard with the oak tree, and told Marcus on the phone, 39 months ago, that this was the right house, that he could feel it, and his father had been a man of strong instincts and careful preparation, a colonel who had run a clean operation in 3 decades of service, and who had died in the spring before Marcus's last deployment, of a heart attack at 71, with his affairs in order, his affairs always in order, and who had left Marcus everything with the precision of someone who had thought about how to do even this final administrative task correctly. He thought about what his father would have made of the past 3 months. He thought his father would have said, "You handled it." He thought his father would also have said, "Now what?" He sat with the house until a light came on in the upstairs window, the tenants stirring, their Saturday beginning. Then he started the car and drove back toward Nashville. On the interstate, his phone buzzed, and he glanced at it at the next rest stop. A text from a number he didn't recognize. Tennessee area code. "I heard you filed a business dissolution. I just wanted you to know the supply debt is yours now, too." He read it twice. Then he forwarded it to Cho with a single line. "Please advise validity of any claim against me personally for dissolved LLC debts." Cho replied within the hour, as he always did on Saturdays, which Marcus had come to understand was not unusual for him. The reply was brief. "No personal liability attaches to you as dissolution officer absent evidence of personal guarantee or fraud in the dissolution process. This message appears to be an attempt at intimidation. You are under no obligation to respond." Marcus deleted the text. He drove the rest of the way home in the particular peace of a man who has been warned about something that cannot touch him. 3 weeks before Christmas, Raymond called from Los Angeles at 11 at night, which meant it was 9 his time, and he had been working. "I have something," Raymond said. Marcus set down the financial forensics textbook he'd been reading. "Tell me." "The contractor I'm working for in L.A., I won't say the name, has a division that handles private forensic services, not institutional, not government, private individuals, corporations, family offices, people who need the kind of analysis I do, but don't have federal agency relationships." A pause. "They're building a subdivision focused specifically on military and veteran financial services. They've been trying to staff it for 8 months. Another pause. "I mentioned your name." Marcus was quiet. "They want to talk," Raymond said. "Not hire you. Not yet. They want to see if there's a structure that makes sense. Maybe a contracted advisory role, maybe a co-founder relationship with the subdivision. They have the infrastructure, the liability coverage, the client relationships. You have the credibility and the specialized knowledge." A pause. "And Webb, they have a client list. Service members who need exactly what you described on the phone 6 weeks ago. People who already need it." Marcus leaned back in the reading chair. He looked at the white walls of the apartment. He had, in the past month, put one thing on them. A framed photograph, black and white, taken by someone in his unit during a mission in Kandahar province. It showed Marcus at a forward position, whilst looking out at the landscape, his back to the camera. The landscape was dust and rock and a hard, pale sky. He was a silhouette against it. He had put it up not as a memorial or a piece of vanity, but as a specific reminder of who he had been in that particular place, at that particular level of clarity and purpose, and of the discipline required to carry that quality of attention into ordinary life. "When do they want to talk?" Marcus said. "January, when you start the Vanderbilt program." "They know about the program?" "I may have mentioned it." Marcus thought about the list on his phone. Item 15. Contact Raymond, Private Sector Transition Options. He pulled up his phone and opened the list. He put a check next to item 15. "Tell them January works," he said. "Already did," Raymond said. But Marcus heard the keyboard in the background. Then Raymond said, more quietly, "I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "When you were sitting in that hotel room the first night back, before you called me, before you called Cho, before any of it." A pause. "What were you feeling?" Marcus considered the question. It was the first time Raymond had asked him something like this, and he recognized it as a departure from their usual register, a deliberate one. "I was feeling that something was over," he said after a moment. "Something that I'd been carrying, not just since the deployment, but for a long time before. A version of my life that I had been trying to inhabit correctly and which did not fit correctly." He paused. "I was feeling the weight of that going away. Not happily, but gone." Raymond was quiet. "And I was feeling," Marcus continued, "that whatever came next was going to be mine. Not built on something else, not inherited or assumed or constructed around another person's requirements. Mine." He paused. "That was what I was feeling." A long silence on Raymond's end. "Okay," Raymond said finally, in the tone of a man who has received an answer he finds adequate. "Okay," Marcus said. They talked for another hour. About the Vanderbilt program, about Raymond's LA contract, about a paper on transaction clustering that Raymond had written and that Marcus had been reading. They talked about a case Raymond had worked that had parallels to the Hargrove LLC pattern. They talked, eventually, about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of talking, and which Marcus had not had access to. Real nothing in particular conversation for a long time. After they hung up, Marcus sat in the reading chair for a while, looking at the photograph on the white wall. The silhouette in the photograph was looking at a landscape he had come back from. He had come back to nothing that he'd expected, and he had converted that nothing into something clean and functional and forward-facing, and the man doing the converting was the same man who had been in that photograph, but was also, in all the ways that mattered, someone new. He got up. He put on a jacket. He went for a late run along the river trail in the December cold, with no music and no company, and the particular sound of the river running fast over the rocks below the trail. He ran 6 miles. He ran 7, and he came back to the apartment, made coffee from a machine that made real coffee, sat at the kitchen table with his phone and his list, and looked at all the items he had not yet addressed. There were many of them. He felt, looking at them, something that he was slow to name. Purpose. That was the word. He opened item 16. Review trust documents for rental property optimization. He started reading. January arrived, and with it the Vanderbilt program, which met twice weekly in a converted classroom in the business school that smelled of old carpet and fresh whiteboard marker, a combination that Marcus found, to his mild surprise, genuinely comforting. The other students in the cohort were mostly mid-career professionals: a corporate auditor, a paralegal with ambitions toward a forensics certification, two IRS employees looking to expand their analytical toolkit. They were, uniformly, not expecting to find in their program an active-duty Special Forces sergeant with an MBA and a specific, operational reason for wanting to understand financial fraud methodology at a granular level. Dr. Osei noticed him in the third session. Not because he raised his hand often, he didn't, but because the quality of his questions was different. They were not the questions of someone learning the material for the first time. They were the questions of someone who had already been inside the material, practically, and wanted to understand the structural underpinnings of what they'd experienced. After the fifth session, she asked him to stay. She was a compact woman in her early 50s, with a directness that Marcus recognized as professional rather than personal. The manner of someone who had spent 12 years asking people very precise questions about things they didn't want to answer. "You've done this work before," she said. "Adjacent to it," Marcus said. "The LLC analysis you described in yesterday's case study. That wasn't theoretical." "No." She looked at him for a moment. "Are you interested in the field professionally, or are you here for a specific application?" "Both," Marcus said. She nodded. She handed him a photocopied article from the Journal of Forensic Accounting Research, a paper she had co-authored on the use of transaction clustering analysis in marital asset dissipation cases. "This may be relevant to whatever you're working on," she said. And he read it that night. He had 4 questions by morning, which he wrote down and brought to the next class. The January meeting with Raymond's LA contacts took place over video conference, 2 weeks into the Vanderbilt program. There were 3 people on the call: a managing partner of the private forensics firm named David Song, a woman named Andrea Reyes, no relation, which Marcus noted with a clinical neutrality, who ran the firm's client development operations, and a veteran-focused financial attorney named Kirk Dawson, who had been brought in specifically because of Marcus's profile. The conversation ran 2 hours. They were interested in exactly what Raymond had described: a collaboration structure in which Marcus's credibility, military background, and developing forensic expertise would anchor a subdivision focused on financial services for active duty and veteran clients. The firm provided the infrastructure, compliance coverage, client pipeline, analytical support. Marcus provided the face and the expertise. He asked 12 questions. They answered all 12. He did not commit on the call. He told them he would review the structure documents they offered to provide and respond within 2 weeks. After the call, he called Raymond. "Well," Raymond said. "It's real," Marcus said. "I told you. Song is sharp. Reyes is a closer. She was running the whole meeting through Song without him noticing, which is either a red flag or an excellent sign about how the firm actually operates." Marcus paused. "Dawson is the honest one." "Oh, he said 2 things in that call that the others weren't saying, and both of them were things I needed to know." "What did he say?" "He said the client pipeline in the military forensics space is entirely referral-based, that there's no advertising, no marketing, it's word of mouth through JAG networks and veterans organizations, and he said the first year will be slow." Marcus paused. "He said it because he wanted to set honest expectations, and nobody asked him to say it." "And?" Raymond's tone said he already knew the answer. "And those are the people I want to work with," Marcus said. He called Dawson separately the next morning and asked him 3 more questions. Dawson answered them the same way, directly, without spin. Marcus reviewed the structure documents over 5 days. He forwarded them to Gerald Cho for review. Cho identified 2 provisions that required clarification and 1 that required modification. Marcus communicated these back to the firm through Dawson. The provisions were clarified. The modification was made. He signed the collaboration agreement on a Tuesday afternoon in Cho's Nashville office, and afterward Cho said, in a tone Marcus had not heard from him before, "Your father would have found this extremely satisfying." Marcus thought about his father. The colonel, who had run a clean operation, who had kept his affairs in order, who had left everything arranged and labeled and accounted for. "He would have had notes," Marcus said. Cho laughed, a real laugh, which Marcus had also not heard from him before. "Yes," he said, "he absolutely would have had notes." 6 months after returning from Helmand Province, Gentlemen, Marcus Webb began his first client engagement with Song Reyes and Dawson Financial Forensics, Specialized Veterans Division. The client was a Marine Corps staff sergeant named Luis Ortega, stationed at Camp Lejeune, who had discovered on returning from a 7-month deployment that his wife had drawn down their joint accounts and used a series of transfers to fund what appeared to be a small retail business registered in her sister's name. The business had no revenue. The transfers totaled approximately $22,000. Marcus read the file that Dawson sent him on a Sunday evening. He made 7 pages of notes. He identified 3 specific evidentiary threads that would require documentation. He drafted an initial analysis framework and sent it to Dawson by 10 p.m. Dawson replied at 6 the next morning. "This is exactly what we needed. Staff Sergeant Ortega's consult is scheduled for Thursday." Marcus looked at the response. He looked at the 7 pages of notes. He looked out the window at the Nashville skyline, which had, in 6 months, become genuinely familiar. The exact shape of it in the morning light, the particular configuration of glass and steel that meant he was home. He made coffee. He thought about Ortega, who was on the other side of a discovery that Marcus knew the shape of, the exact interior geography of standing on a tarmac and pulling out your phone, and understanding, through the coded language of bank notifications, that the world you'd been carrying in your head for 7 months no longer corresponded to the world that existed. What he thought about what he was going to be able to give Ortega that Ortega did not currently have. The documentation, the analysis, the precise language for what had happened. The knowledge, before walking through the door, of what he was walking into. He thought about Raymond's saying, "The most dangerous man in any room is the one who already knows what happened before he walked in." He was going to make sure Ortega walked in knowing. He opened the file again. He picked up his pen. He got to work. Dawson called him on a Friday, 2 months into the collaboration, with a referral from a JAG officer at Fort Bragg, a female Army captain who had been the one doing the financial forensics on behalf of a client, was only to discover that the opposing counsel was attempting to conceal a business interest in the client's spouse's name that bore a remarkable structural resemblance to the Hargrove LLC pattern. She had heard, through the JAG network, about Marcus's work on a similar structure in Tennessee. She wanted to consult. Marcus took the call that afternoon, sitting at his desk in the apartment with the white walls and the one photograph. The captain was sharp and precise and slightly frustrated, the frustration of someone who could see the fraud clearly but needed better documentation tools to make it visible in a proceeding. He spent 40 minutes on the call. He walked her through the transaction clustering methodology. He described the public records threads to pull. He referenced Dr. Ossi's paper and 2 others. He told her what to look for in the operating agreement. At the end of the call, she was quiet for a moment. "How do you know all this?" she asked. Marcus looked at the photograph on the wall. The silhouette, the hard, pale sky, the landscape of dust and rock. "I had time to prepare," he said. He heard her writing something. "I'm going to refer 2 more cases your way," she said. "If that's all right." "That's fine," Marcus said. He ended the call. He looked at the list on his phone. Item 14. MBA to CP, A Bridge Program Inquiry. Checked. Item 15. Contact Raymond, Private Sector Transition. Checked. Item 16. Review trust documents for rental property optimization. Checked. Item 17, which he had added recently in a moment of deliberate forward motion. Begin first client engagement. Checked. Dearson, he scrolled to item 18, which he had also added recently, and which was different in character from the others. It said, simply, figure out what you want. He looked at that item for a moment. Then he put the phone down and picked up the current chapter of Dr. Osei's advanced coursework on forensic accounting in family law proceedings, which he had been reading with the sustained attention of a man who finds, in the architecture of complex systems made visible, something that corresponds to his own interior architecture. Orderly, precise, capable of being understood if you are willing to put in the hours required. He was willing. He had always been willing. Outside, Nashville was doing its spring thing. Late March, the particular smell of it coming through the cracked window. Of something green and alive and not at all like jet fuel or sand. He noted it. He filed it. He kept reading. The deposition was held in a law office in downtown Nashville on a Thursday morning in early April, in a small conference room with bad lighting and a pitcher of water that nobody touched. The deposition was not Marcus's. He was not a party to any ongoing proceeding. He was there in his capacity as a financial forensics consultant to provide expert testimony in a proceeding that involved, tangentially, documentation generated during the dissolution of Hargrove Consolidated LLC. Dana's attorney, a new one now, not Calloway, had issued a subpoena seeking certain records from the dissolved entity in connection with a separate matter involving Hargrove and the building materials supplier who had filed the creditor's claim. Marcus sat at the conference table in a suit he had bought for exactly this purpose. Dark charcoal, not elaborate, the kind of suit that communicated competence without trying to communicate anything else. Gerald Cho sat beside him. Across the table sat the attorney for the supplier and a paralegal who took notes. The questions were technical and precise, focused entirely on the mechanics of the LLC's dissolution and the disposition of its records. Marcus answered each one with the same measured clarity he brought to everything. No elaboration, no emotion, no information beyond what was asked. He had been deposed once before in connection with a routine administrative matter during his second deployment, and he had learned then that a deposition was not a conversation. It was a documentation exercise, and the optimal participant in a documentation exercise provided clean, accurate, verifiable facts, and nothing else. The deposition took 45 minutes. On the way out, Cho said, "You were very good in there." "Thank you." "You've done this kind of testimony before?" "No, but I've given briefings under pressure to people who were looking for something to use against me, and the principle is the same." A pause. Know your facts. Provide only your facts. Don't try to win. Cho considered this as they waited for the elevator. "You know," he said, "your father had a similar quality in depositions. I took several with him years ago. He had a stillness that made opposing counsel nervous." The elevator arrived. They got in. Marcus thought about his father's stillness. But he had grown up watching it from the outside and not quite understanding it, had sometimes, as a child, resented it, felt it as a form of unavailability. It was only later, in the field, that he'd understood it for what it was. Not absence, but discipline. Not coldness, but control. He had inherited it. He had not known, until now, how exactly he would use it. "I'll be in touch about the Ortega proceeding," he said to Cho when they reached the lobby. I'll have the draft testimony outlined by next week, Cho said. They shook hands. Cho went to his car. Marcus stood in the lobby for a moment, looking at the street through the glass doors. It was a spring day, warm and clear, the kind of day Nashville had in abundance in April, the kind of day that required nothing particular of you except the small decision of where to go next. But he had a client call at 2. He had the Vanderbilt program Tuesday evening. He had, tonight, nothing planned, which was an expanse of time he was slowly learning to inhabit without filling it immediately with purpose. He pushed through the glass doors. He went for a walk. A long walk, through the downtown streets, with no particular direction, watching the city move around him with the complete perceptual attention he applied to everything, and which, in this context, asked nothing of him in return. He walked for an hour. He bought a coffee from a cart on Church Street. Cheap paper cup, the kind of coffee that costs $2 and tastes like what coffee would taste like if you explained the concept to someone who had never had it, and they did their best. And he drank it standing at the corner, was watching the traffic lights cycle through their patient, indifferent sequence. He was 31 years old, recently divorced, newly collaborative in a forensics firm that was building something real, living in an apartment with white walls and one photograph, and running every morning along the river in the particular quality of Tennessee light that he had carried in his memory through 14 months of dust and rock, and had come home to find still there, unchanged, waiting for him like a piece of the world that had kept its promise. He finished the coffee. He threw the cup. He took out his phone and opened the list. Item 18. Figure out what you want. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he typed, below it, a new item, item 19. And he put the phone back in his pocket and walked on. But he didn't look at it again until that evening, when he was back at the apartment, at the kitchen table, with the window open and the Nashville spring coming through, and a real coffee in his hand, and the forensic accounting coursework open in front of him, and he pulled out the phone and read what he'd written to himself on the street corner. Item 19. Start building something that lasts. He looked at it. Then he opened a new document on his laptop and typed, at the top of the blank page, the name he had been thinking about for 3 months, and had not yet committed to paper. He stared at the name. He typed, under it, a single line. Services for service members who don't have a Raymond Park. He looked at that line for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Raymond Park. Raymond answered on the first ring. I have a name, Marcus said.